So thank you very much, everyone, for joining the webinar today. It's brought to you by the American Planning Association's Massachusetts Chapter, Transportation Committee, and the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization. My name is Daniel Amstutz. I'm a Senior Transportation Planner for the town of Arlington, Massachusetts, and I'll be the moderator today. So on the next slide, everyone should be joined with muted microphones so that we don't have any background noise coming through while people are presenting or we're talking, and minimize interruptions. So to participate in the Q&A, we're going to go to the chat. So the chat will be open for you to make questions that we'll do the Q&A at the end of the presentations. If you have any technical difficulties, please chat with Logan Casey, who's the staff at the Boston MPO, and he can help you out with that. He's helping run this webinar today. And then today's webinar has been approved for 1.5 AICP certification maintenance credits. So on the next slide, the APA MA Transportation Committee plays an active role within the Massachusetts chapter by providing a forum for transportation professionals, students, and other interested parties to discuss transportation planning issues, increasing fellowship among committee members through the exchange of information and ideas, and furthering transportation and land use planners' knowledge of the transportation planning process, transportation infrastructure, operating authorities, and other stakeholders within Massachusetts. So we represent local, regional, and municipal planners in the public and private sectors and are engaged locally, regionally, and nationally. So I'll say again, this webinar has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for your AICP. If you have any questions or you want to learn more about joining the Transportation Committee, please feel free to contact me at my email down below, damstutz@town.arlington.ma.us. So let's get along to starting things. I'm very excited to introduce the presenters for this webinar. So we'll have 3 presentations today and then have Q&A at the end. And the first 2 presenters are Betsy Harvey and Blake Acton from the Boston Region MPO, and then we'll hear from Jason Schreiber of Stantec. So we're going to start with Betsy. Betsy has 10 years of experience working in the public and academic sectors. For the past 6 years, she has been the Transportation Equity Program Manager at the Boston Region MPO. There, she is responsible for monitoring the MPO's civil rights compliance, developing metrics, analyses, and methods for evaluating equity in the MPO's planning processes, and engaging with marginalized communities in MPO work. She has a master's degree in city and regional planning from Rutgers and a bachelor's degree in English from the University of New Hampshire. Betsy will be discussing the MPO's Transportation Recovery Guidebook for commercial business districts. Excuse me. Take it away, Betsy.
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to talk to you today about the guidebook that the MPO recently produced this past winter to help towns recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The guidebook is called Transportation Recovery Guidebook for Commercial Business Districts, or CBDs. And while the guidebook is not specifically about curbs, it does examine ways in which curb space has been used and is continued to be used and adapted to help towns adapt and thrive during the pandemic. So the goal of the work was to develop this guidebook for municipalities as they plan for transportation access into their CBDs. And while the guidebook does focus on the Boston area, as you'll see, the methods we use can be adapted to whatever municipality you are, wherever you are in Massachusetts and whatever your community size. The recommendations that are in the guidebook cover a wide range of community types. And we interviewed folks during the guidebook production process who lived in a lot of different types of communities. And so I hope that more rural and suburban folks will also find information that resonates with your community. The guidebook is really unique in that it takes a holistic view of the forces that affect CBD recovery from pandemics. Rather than looking at transportation in a silo, it considers the role of other sectors as well, such as public health, housing, climate change, and the economy. So the intention is that the recommendations will not only help CBDs recover from the pandemic, but help them build back in a way that leaves them more economically vibrant, equitable, and resilient. So to help us understand how COVID-19 has affected CBDs in the Boston region, as well as strategies and actions that they have employed to support community access to their CBDs during the pandemic, we put together a case study of 12 CBDs within 11 towns. 2 of those CBDs were in Boston. And you can see them on the map on the screen. The green, darker green are the towns themselves, and the purple little dots on the screen are the specific locations of the CBDs. To select the CBDs, we looked at a variety of different characteristics. We wanted a range of transportation access. Some of the towns have no public transit access. Some of them have very rich public transit access, such as bus, rapid transit, and rail, and others are in between. We also wanted to have a range of geographic and economic diversity and municipality size, and we specifically sought out municipalities that had a large share of EJ population, environmental justice population. So one of the most challenging ways or things about writing this guidebook was figuring out how do we write something where the pandemic is continuously evolving, that is enmeshed in all areas of our lives, and not just transportation, and for which is really very little precedence in the modern era. When the study was first approved by our MPO board back in, I guess it's in 2020, we had no vaccine. We were all very, isolated in quarantine. And then fast forward to when we were writing the guidebook the past summer, last summer, and family park was full again. We had vaccinations, and then now, a year later, we are in a different situation where we have fluctuated between waves of different variants that seem to be more contagious, and so that is a very challenging situation to be in. And how do you plan for that uncertainty? And so we needed a guidebook to adapt to whatever the future of the pandemic was going to be, so that we could help folks recover in a way that allowed them to build back stronger. And so to do so, we turned to a process called Exploratory Scenario Planning, or Xsp. It's a type of scenario planning, and it's designed specifically to support decision-making where there is a significant amount of uncertainty and where there are multiple interconnected forces at play, which is definitely the case with the COVID-19 pandemic. And the outcome of this Xsp process is a set of actions and strategies that will be beneficial regardless of what the future brings. And that's what's really unique about Xsp compared to other types of scenario planning that you may be familiar with. We're not planning for a particular future, but we're planning to thrive no matter what the future ends up being. So we used a version of Xsp to develop recommendations that you'll find in the guidebook. The flow chart on the screen shows the 6 steps that we went through. I'm not going to go through all 6 steps in detail, but I want to focus on 2 of those steps. Steps 2 and 3, which are brainstorming and ranking driving forces that will have the biggest impact on CBD recovery, and determining which of those driving forces are critical uncertainties, and which of those are critical certainties. These are really the elements that shape the recommendations that are developed at the end of an Xsp process. And so my hope is that whether you live and work in the Berkshires or Worcester or Boston, you can use Xsp and apply it to whatever work you do. The guidebook does contain some information and links about Xsp in general, and so you can certainly investigate that as well for your own work. And one of the advantages of Xsp is that it is very scalable to the resources that you have available and applicable to pretty much any topic. So let's talk a little bit about the driving forces. I'll start with the certainties, or critical certainties.
Hi, Betsy. I apologize for the interruption. Could you get a little closer to your microphone? I guess a few people are having a little tough time hearing you.
Yep. Sorry about that. Is this better?
I think so. Yes.
Okay. AC was going on in the background, so that may have also had an issue. So Driving forces are those forces, whether they're technological or societal or environmental or political, that affect how well and how quickly CBDs and the transportation networks that serve them recover from the pandemic. And those forces, some of those are more certain than others. Uncertainties as they sound are those things that we are confident will happen, and they're common to kind of all futures. And the sorts of things that we considered as certainties as we were developing this guidebook is the high vaccination rate in Massachusetts. We know that over 80% of the population has been fully vaccinated. We know that the MBTA has shifted some of its service to focus on providing transit critical populations or in better transportation service, such as switching the commuter rail schedules to be more frequent throughout the day rather than on the peak evening and morning periods. We also know that there's been an increased desire for active transportation and outdoor recreation access. It's becoming more and more popular during the pandemic as a way to kind of get out of your house and to socialize. And we also know that, unfortunately, there are persistent socioeconomic and racial inequalities. We hope, of course, that isn't a permanent trend, but it certainly continues to be a big challenge within our state. And then finally, we know that people are increasingly preferring to use e-commerce to purchase their goods. And that, as well as the desire for increased active transportation, has put a lot of pressure on the curb, as well as in terms of planning for space to accommodate all those needs, as well as other needs that we've had, even before COVID. We also looked at what the uncertainties are, and those are, so I think, fairly straightforward. It means basically anything we are kind of uncertain about in terms of what the future will bring. And they are really kind of the big driving forces that will affect how well or how poorly CBDs will recover from COVID-19. And these include things like the length and the severity of the pandemic, changes to mode share. Not sure how that will play out, and that may vary between different municipalities. We've seen that in places like Chelsea and Lynn, that transit mode share has been much more sustainable and robust, partly a function of the reliance of many people in those towns on public transportation for their needs. We've also seen in other towns that are particularly dependent on commuter rail ridership or on kind of office workers commuting to those towns, that there's been a real decrease in commute share and mode share among those commuters on public transit. We're also not sure how consumer shopping preferences will impact long-term the store business models, in terms of how will e-commerce impact that, and how will stores adapt to kind of meet those consumer interests in more delivery and e-commerce types of shopping, and how will that affect the foot traffic in those municipalities if people are no longer kind of going to stores as often, or if commuters are no longer kind of using going out for dinner or going out to different places that they would have normally if they were kind of commuting regularly to their offices. We also have yet to see the full impact of employer remote work policies, and as employers roll those out, how will that affect the housing demand and the role of remote work in where people choose to live. Again, but keeping in mind that this is not for everybody. Not everybody can have the choice of whether to work remotely, because sometimes their jobs require them to be there in person. And also, how will that affect the demand for office space, especially in towns like Boston or Quincy or Framingham, where there is a large office space, office worker population. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things we heard on the interviews that we took, or that we did with some of the planners at the towns that I showed on a map earlier in the presentation, in terms of what has worked and in terms of helping them recover from COVID and adapt to the realities of the pandemic. One is the importance of pursuing creative avenues for public engagement. Obviously, we have not been able to do a lot of our usual in-person meetings. As that's coming back, I think that offers a lot of opportunity for balancing both remote and virtual and in-person meetings, and really thereby expanding access for more and more people to the planning work that we do. We also heard in every single interview how important quick build projects were, and all the projects that people had done across the state and the region to quickly build projects like shared public spaces, parklets, outdoor dining, temporary bike lanes, things like that. The MassDOT Shared Streets and Spaces grant program funded a lot of this and has been wildly popular. And it really demonstrated an opportunity to rethink how curb spaces can be used and demonstrate the usefulness of pilot projects when you're trying to figure out and introduce a new idea to a community. In some towns, at first, in most towns did not face much resistance replacing parking space with parklets or outdoor dining, just because people weren't going out in 2020 and much of 2021. But in some cases, the parking has come back, and in some cases it hasn't. And certainly Blake will touch on that more in his presentation about parking and other curb uses. Folks also talked about being willing to experiment with new ideas and processes, such as kind of what I referenced, public engagement, using pilots and other kind of creative ways to implement transportation infrastructure and programs that they hadn't had to do before. People also talked about how important collaboration was with other municipalities, especially smaller ones, in order to gain access to grants. Smaller towns may not have enough people on staff to really pursue grant applications that could be time consuming, and so partnering particularly with larger neighboring municipalities proved to be a very useful strategy, and it often sets you up better anyway, because a lot of grant applications do prefer that there is some sort of partnership. And finally, some towns took advantage of a pre-pandemic transportation planning agenda that they'd already kind of set in motion. The funding from the feds really gave them the opportunity to advance more quickly a lot of the projects that they'd already wanted to do. So I think that does speak to the importance of kind of doing that upfront work, that upfront planning and design work, so that that you are ready to take advantage of funding. Hopefully we don't have to be in this situation again anytime soon, but certainly it's a good practice. So I want to turn now to the recommendations that we produce out of the Xsp planning process. We used that Xsp process to, as well as the input we got from interviewees, to come up with the actions and strategies that we felt municipalities could take to prevent negative outcomes and support future outcomes that they want in terms of kind of how their CBD is functioning and thriving. And the key characteristics about Xsp recommendations is that they are low or no regret solutions. And that's one thing that is pretty unique about Xsp. We're not talking about making a huge monetary investment necessarily, but rather good practices that are scalable and that can be adaptable to kind of whatever situation you're in your community. And they're designed specifically to respond to the uncertainties that we describe in the report. So you can see on the purple header that there are the driving forces. And then on the left-hand side is the strategy and action. And the gray circle means that the recommendation would likely provide minimal support for adapting to the driving force, but that green triangle indicates that the recommendation would likely help the municipality adapt or to change the direction of the driving force in a positive way. So you can kind of see, oh, maybe I'm really concerned about the economy of my CBD, so I want to focus on those green triangle recommendations under the brick and mortar business models or the consumer shopping preferences section. We divided the recommendations into two categories, which is a little bit more clear in the guidebook itself. They're divided specifically first, looking at the systematic and process strategies, such as public engagement or developing a curb management plan. And And then the second category was more infrastructural, programmatic sorts of things, such as kind of building quick build projects or investing in pedestrian or bicycle improvements. So my last slide is to just kind of to show you what the recommendations contain, so you get a taste of what we want to provide municipalities as tools or actions that they can take quickly or with fairly easily. So we have several recommendations related to curb space, such as developing a curb management plan, establishing outdoor dining program, implementing quick build projects, improving access to outdoor public spaces, and investing in public transit for essential workers. This slide just shows the municipal dining program, and you can see the content where we describe why we chose that particular recommendation, why it's important. We list example case studies, in this case from Lynn, and the case studies, there are kind of more detailed description of case studies of each of the case studies in the report. So you can kind of go back and refer to Lynn, for example, if you're interested to see what they had to say about outdoor dining. We also put a estimated implementation timeframe, in this case, short. I mean, it's not precise, but it gives you a sense of the level of effort and timing. We also listed funding opportunities and technical assistance that's available. You can see that there are 3 available for this particular recommendation. This is current as of last fall, but we did try to make sure that we selected the technical assistance or funding that is kind of stable and things that we felt that were going to stick around for a while. And then finally, each recommendation has a list of resources that you can refer to for kind of more in-depth information about the particular recommendation. So that is all that I have to present, and hopefully this has proven helpful for you to help think about how to prepare your curb space and your towns for a resilient future in the face of an uncertain pandemic. And I also hope you'll think about using Xsp to tackle other multidimensional challenges that will inevitably occur over our lifetimes, certainly not least of which is the threat of climate change. Because if we know one thing for certain out of the pandemic, that nothing is a sure thing, and we need to be prepared as municipalities and as planners to adapt to whatever the future does bring. So I thank you for your time and look forward to answering your questions later.
Great, thank you very much, Betsy. All right, moving on to our next presenter. We're going to hear from Blake Acton about his work on the Future of the Curb project and the resulting MPO guidebook on managing curb space. So Blake is a transit analyst at the Boston Region MPO. Prior to beginning his career at the MPO in 2020, Blake completed a bachelor's degree at the University of Missouri and a master's degree from Ohio State University, both in geography. His research and academic interests are in bus rapid transit, streetcars, transit, and land use. Take it away, Blake.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction, Dan. Am I unmuted? Okay.
We can hear you.
It's always good to ask that before you start talking too much. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to present our curb management guidebook that we created for planners who are interested in getting started with curb management in their municipality. I'd also like to note that links to this guidebook and the CBD guidebook that Betsy presented are in the chat, or will be very shortly. So I invite you to please check them out. Great. So with our guidebook, we really aimed to introduce and establish the practice of curb management, sort of define what it is. And we did that by examining different case studies around the Boston region, best practices and challenges in the area. But more importantly, we really aspired to provide planners with a set of realistic and practical strategies that they can use to more effectively manage curb space in their municipality. And also I'd finally like to note that while we did orient the guidebook to the Boston region, as we are the Boston Region MPO, our recommendations would be useful to any municipal planner who's interested in getting started with curb management in their respective municipalities. So we put together a pretty detailed and comprehensive document. So we don't have the time to cover every recommendation and everything that we cover in the guidebook. So I will briefly define some terms and summarize some of our interview findings, and then outline 3 foundations of curb management, and then finally discuss a few scenarios of how planners could apply some of specific strategies described in the guidebook to their municipality. So first off, it's always good to define sort of what we're talking about. So what is curb space in reference to what we are writing about and what we're talking about today? So curb space can be roughly defined as the area between the street curb and the roadway or the travel way. This area is typically inhabited by parking, and it is an increasingly valuable space in the city and in urban areas in general, especially in more dense urban areas where this space could be potentially used for anything from any kind of travel lane to parking, deliveries, freight, outdoor dining, or as for dedicated lanes for bikes or buses or both. And what curb management seeks to do is define which of these uses would most effectively serve the needs of the surrounding community. And ideally, we aim to treat this space as sort of a blank slate to sort of reframe curb space away from the tradition that parking is sort of the default and everything else is an alternative. However, in many cases, this approach isn't realistic, especially because parking dominates the vast majority of curb space in the cities today. Our curb management strategies that we describe, in order for them to be useful, we need to sort of acknowledge this reality so that we're addressing how things actually are in the world as opposed to how they ideally should be. So to create this guidebook, we interviewed 27 different professionals comprised mostly of municipal transportation planners. From our interviews, we learned that curb management is mostly a new topic, and that today curbs are managed in a largely reactive and ad hoc fashion. We find that sometimes you'll find curb management related strategies sort of siloed in various parking or transportation plans or in cycling plans, but rarely will you see a comprehensive plan that sort of integrates all of these things together. And we found a strong desire for practical strategies and ideas to sort of help that process and integrate their curb management into a more unified approach. So let's talk about sort of some of the foundations and recommendations we make in the guidebook. The first foundation that we recommend is to build a community coalition of allies that can help develop and accomplish curb management goals. This is important because curb space is so valuable with many different competing needs and priorities, and planners have little power on their own to affect curb use. By establishing committees and commissions and maintaining outreach, planners can identify issues and collect feedback and to promote projects and goals. We advise that planners develop a trusting relationship with local elected officials that can serve as a champion for curb management efforts. Many curb management projects could potentially be attractive to elected officials since they are typically small scale, affordable, but highly visible projects that would enable an elected official to impact their communities within a short election cycle, as opposed to a larger multi-million-dollar infrastructure project, for example. So the second foundation that we recommend is to develop something that we call a curb priority matrix. And this is a diagram essentially that prioritizes different curb uses within each land use that is aligned with the goals of your community. So in this example priority matrix, land uses are along the top, We have like downtown commercial, downtown mixed use as different land uses. And within each column, the curb uses are represented in each cell, and the higher they are in the column, the higher the priority is. So for example, in the matrix in the center here under the neighborhood commercial district, we put the highest priority curb use as activation of public space. So this would mean that providing sufficient outdoor dining and parklet space in this neighborhood has a higher priority than, let's say, parking, for example. So this may look like maybe some kind of small neighborhood community with perhaps narrow streets with a few businesses that could really benefit from sort of an outdoor dining installation. So in that situation, perhaps you would want to prioritize some kind of public space next to these businesses over other curb uses. But it's important to note that the matrix shown here is merely an example of what a matrix could look like. Each community's priority matrix will look different depending on the unique land uses and neighborhoods in their community. And as municipalities develop their curb management plans, their matrix may evolve over time, and land uses may become more specific, and eventually they may be accompanied by a map that details the extent of each land use. So the third foundation that we recommend is to create some sort of curb inventory. This should ideally be a searchable database with curb regulations by location and by time. Municipalities need to choose between in-house or vendor options to develop their curb databases. Each option has its own advantages and disadvantages, with in-house options offering more control, while vendor options allow for faster collection and more off-the-shelf analysis tools. Regardless, whichever option your municipality chooses, it's important that the database needs to be capable of answering simple questions and queries, such as how many parking spaces are available on this block at 5 p.m. Curbs change frequently, so ideally the database should be easily updatable on sort of an ongoing basis, ideally in the field as changes happen. Different municipal workers should be able to update the database remotely so that it's reliable, and that when you actually do implement some kind of curb change, that what you're talking about in the database reflects reality. So moving on from the foundations, let's walk through a few scenarios of how planners could use the guidebook further to address some more specific curb management issues. And we begin our scenarios with a parking study. We recommend that planners frequently begin their comprehensive survey with a comprehensive survey of parking utilization and turnover, both on and off-street parking near their area of interest. Parking studies assist with many aspects of the curb management process. Planners can learn if, where, and when there's too much parking, where and when to focus price interventions. But more importantly, they can be used to find opportunities to replace underutilized parking with new curb uses. And finally, they can help planners defend projects and proposals against what I sometimes commonly refer to as the law of curb management. That is that there is a continuous and pervasive perception that there is never enough parking anywhere. All right, so after we complete a parking study, we're presented with two primary outcomes, which can help us decide what to do next. If we find that occupancy is greater than about 90%, we may decide to increase prices, which decreases demand by encouraging shorter parking durations and shifting demand to alternative parking options and other modes of travel. Alternatively, we can increase supply, which has largely been the default option in most American cities for decades. However, as we have increasingly learned as a profession, over the long term, this is an expensive trap that encourages more car dependency and feeds a vicious cycle that increases parking demand. On the other hand, if we find occupancy is less than 90%, which is often the case, then that presents us with an opportunity to repurpose some of that underutilized curb space with something else that may better serve the needs of the community. So let's walk through a few hypothetical scenarios of how a planner could respond to different outcomes of the parking study. So in this first scenario, we find that there's a less than 90% parking utilization. So we decide to replace some curb parking with a higher priority curb use. Just like in the slide from a few ago with the curb priority matrix. In this land use, it's described as neighborhood commercial with activation of public space listed as the highest curb priority. In our hypothetical municipality, this land use could describe an area that has favorable conditions for outdoor dining with low traffic volumes and speeds. Perhaps there's street trees and narrow streets with local establishments primarily visited by nearby residents, many of whom access the area by walking, biking, or transit. And as a result, we decide to replace some of the street parking with parklets and outdoor dining areas. In our second scenario, we have the same result as the first, where we find overall lower parking utilization. Just like before, we decide to replace parking with different curb priority use. For this land use type, described as a neighborhood connector, our highest priority is to move people and goods through the area. Perhaps this area describes a congested high traffic corridor with lots of transit ridership. So in this scenario, we decide to replace curb parking with a dedicated bus lane, since it would be the most efficient way to move the most number of people through the corridor. However, unlike the previous scenario, we may need to replace multiple blocks of parking spaces to build a bus lane, which will likely experience pushback. So what do we recommend in this scenario? So to address this issue, we recommend proposing a quick build project. Quick builds are small scale, fast, low cost temporary projects that demonstrate a new curb use without the risk of committing to a permanent change. In our case, we could build a bus lane with simple traffic cones and signs, and we can experiment with a bus lane while shortcutting the lengthy approval process, since we're not building a permanent project. If the temporary bus lane doesn't work out, the cones can simply be removed. A critical component to a successful quick build is to include a plan to evaluate the impact of the project and collect feedback from the community. This data will inform the next action. Should the project be removed? Could it be moved somewhere else? Perhaps it needs to be adjusted, or perhaps the intervention was well received and it should be made permanent. So in our third scenario, we find a different result where we have high parking utilization. And so a response to this could potentially be to increase the parking price, which by increasing the parking price, then that would end up decreasing the utilization to less than 90%. And that would potentially allow you to do the same thing as before, which would allow you to replace some of that parking perhaps with a higher priority curb use. So this is sort of a highly simplified, idealized string of circumstances. And so what we'd like to talk about is strategies for how to introduce potentially introducing parking prices or increasing parking prices, and let's say a business district. So a few strategies that we recommend for introducing prices in a central business district could be, our first thing that we recommend is to approach business owners early in the process so that the planner can introduce the idea and attempt to address any concerns that the business owner may have. This could involve surveys and mailers, but the most effective way is to visit them in person. This demonstrates respect and helps develop a more friendly rapport. It also gives the planner a chance to set a constructive and civil tone before the business owner potentially develops their own perceptions of the project from other sources, perhaps from the news or social media or from rumor. After setting the tone, we recommend that planners emphasize the benefits of increased parking turnover. Our parking study in this scenario shows low available supply, so visitors to the area may avoid visiting since they do not believe that they could find parking. and drivers will generate more traffic as they search for open spaces. So introducing metered parking increases the vehicle turnover by incentivizing visitors to leave within a more reasonable time frame, which leaves more spots open for more visitors. The result is more customers per hour for that business. Finally, we recommend that planners consider introducing prices with something called a parking benefit district, or PBD. With a PBD, local parking revenue is reinvested back into the district. It can be managed by a committee comprised of local stakeholders who can recommend price adjustments or projects to prioritize for the local parking revenue. District income can be reinvested into district improvements such as crosswalks or lighting or street trees, which would enhance the attractiveness of the district, which would ultimately draw in more visitors. That creates a virtuous cycle that leads to more parking revenue, which would, of course, lead to more customers for the local businesses. All right, that is all I have for you today. Thank you for your time, and I will hand it off to our moderator.
Thank you very much, Blake. All right, so our third and final presenter is Jason Schreiber, who's going to discuss how municipalities can effectively measure curb space. So Jason is a senior principal at Stantec. In more than 25 years as a transportation planner, he's helped hundreds of cities, institutions, and developers broaden options for urban mobility. He's shown governments from Boston to Abu Dhabi how to manage parking in difficult shared environments. He's helped healthcare clients develop demand management programs that get people out of their cars and onto transit, their feet, or bikes. And he's led well over 100 downtown parking studies that have involved extensive off-street and curbside regulatory changes, which have helped improve community access across the country. All right, Jason, you can get started.
Thank you. Hope you can hear me, and I hope you see the screen now, if that's working correctly.
Yes.
Great. I wanted to sort of begin by really emphasizing the importance of the kind of guidance that we're able to see here today from the MPO. These types of guidebooks, both in response to the pandemic, but also in response to demand that we're seeing throughout the Commonwealth and elsewhere, is really important. And as I've been doing this for so long, I think there are a lot of fundamentals. It's worth having these types of resources nearby. People revisit these questions often, and we want to be able to make sure that it's out there. There's other excellent guidance. The Department of Housing and Community Development has made some, even national sources like NACTO and the Smart Growth Alliance all will talk about what we're going to talk about here today, curb management, but also other forms of downtown revitalization. But I wanted to start first with a basic point. We're all coming across very reactively to both the pandemic and what's happening at the curb. And I wanted to, as planners, reiterate proactively that we all need to think a little bit about the broader perspective on what curbside access is about. And in particular, the fact that our downtowns and our communities, and frankly, almost every place in any community, even rural, is multimodal. And that our system is very much tilted to one primary form of access. And unfortunately, it is the most heavily subsidized form of access, and that is driving. I think if we recognize as planners that it is actually far less cost to society in general to be subsidizing more efficient modes of transportation like transit, biking, and walking, we can begin to go in the right direction. But it's not just us planners who need to know and recognize that. It's anybody who's going into the business of taking care of cars. Parking spaces are expensive. So we cannot expect to construct even just a surface lot for less than $5,000 a space. But if we go up into a structure, it's $25,000. In big cities, we're going down, it's at least $50,000. And these are all low ball numbers. And those expenses add up, particularly when it's underutilized. And a lot of what we're talking about here today is trying to optimize the utilization of existing assets so we don't have to build more parking. And then we can begin to make the trade-off between something very productive, such as a restaurant table or a office space, versus something that really is just housing a machine most of the time, not even entertaining or educating or working in person. And that's an important thing to understand in our congested, particularly historic downtowns. And I hope everybody has seen this slide or this information. This comes from several years ago from Janet Sadekhan and New York City DOT, and how the removal of much parking and other access, particularly drive lanes, to create protected bicycle lanes up and down the length of Manhattan, not only has done great transportation safety things, but boosted retail spending 50% on these corridors. Similarly, getting rid of on-street parking and putting in bus lanes helped the bus, but dramatically increased retail spending. Retail spending activity is really what cities and downtowns really want. And I'll put in a quick pitch for the off-street side of things, because I'm now going to dive into on-street. Every downtown is a shared parking environment. And the more that we promote the sharing of those resources, the less of all this expensive parking that we have to build, and the more we can focus on other uses along the curb. And it's those curbs for on-street parking that are currently extremely inefficiently used. This again comes from NACTO, and I'm going to just focus on the two leftmost bars. This is basically the number of people on a hypothetical block that would have access depending on their mode of access. And certainly walking is the most efficient space-wise. In fact, high-capacity transit is even more efficient than that. And then bikes and transit in terms of buses. But just rideshare or taxis or some form of shared transportation is 30 times more efficient than me just driving and parking a car. When I come and I park and I sit for an hour versus a rideshare vehicle or a taxi or microtransit, that can turn over 30 times as many people for access into a downtown. But it can also mean 30 times more revenue. I mean, in many cities, we're charging, $1 up to even the Chicago's and San Francisco's $7 an hour. Back Bay Boston is over $4. What does that mean if we instead have revenues that are dedicated, much like the example that Blake talked about in Arlington, into a parking benefit district, because we're handling that many more vehicles? Or more importantly, can that translate into dollars for retail? If I'm going to drop and park and spend an average of $50 for dinner or buying shoes or buying clothes, just imagine if that one parking space can handle 30 times as many people. The efficiency of on-street parking today is something that even the development community has recognized can be improved dramatically. We're seeing lots of developers trying to go from a typical pro forma that's building a large building and has to build a $20 million garage because cities require it, to turning their streetscape into an active pickup and drop-off zone, to treating it as a dynamic terminal, if you will, that allows them to make a lot more money, but also change the modal profile. And in every community in America, large and small, we can be aiming to make our curbs the terminals of the future. So this type of future is something that I'd ultimately like to see us all get towards. And it is actually kind of these two projects I'll talk about, the essence of what they were looking for. So in Tampa, they had a lot of congestion pre-pandemic, and the study was prior to the pandemic and then went into the pandemic, and they're now implementing the recommendations post-pandemic, where TNCs, Ubers, Lyfts, and they also had now a lot of the e-scooters were congesting intersections and really causing a problem. They're looking for a good management solution. So the first thing everybody and anybody should do is count cars. And we already heard that. We need to understand what the parking demand is. I won't go into the details of how to count cars, but essentially map every block, count how many cars are there as frequently as you can throughout the course of the day, have a good inventory in advance, just like the guidebook says before you start to feed into that, and do it periodically. Map activity as often as you can across as many hours of the day, as many seasons, as many years in a row. It's infinitely valuable for managing front door access to businesses. But it's only one mode. And while it is the most essential piece of data, what we're trying to do for Tampa is understand all that other activity, because the TNC doesn't park. So we started by just something anybody can do. Go to your local assessing database and pull out your activity and map, retail and restaurant, for instance, at the ground floor. Where is that? It's sometimes hard to figure that one out. So we come up with an estimate for the amount of demand from retail or restaurants, number of cars parked per hour. Comes straight out of ITE guidebooks. And then, of course, above that, there's all sorts of other uses. And in Tampa, they've got towers of many stories high, and they're both residential as well as commercial. But that all is activity. And so what we did was we generated a basically parking generation map of their downtown to understand what was the intensity of use. Now, Tampa happened to also have some fledgling activity data from TNCs. And many communities have been successful negotiating with Uber and Lyft to get some of their data shared open platform. It's to their advantage to do it because you'll see the outcome of this is to their advantage. And similarly, they also had Bird and Lime scooters running around. So there was some level of activity on the streets there. But these levels of activity were far less important. It was ultimately we created for them guidance on how to manage their curbs based on the land use activity. And here it's shaded in purple where there's more demand for more access. And again, we're only talking about here TNC and maybe the micromobility devices. But because we had mapped the demand of the curb, and most importantly, we had mapped the demand of the parcels onto that curb, and we were able to say, wow, there's going to be a lot of need here. We could say you're going to need 4 TNC spaces in this busy zone, 2 here. And that's an important outcome for a community that then needs to go ahead and figure out how to make those spaces work. So previously, TNCs were just coming into the corner of an intersection because that was where it was clear. There was a crosswalk there. And so they're blocking crosswalks, often blocking bike lanes, and doing it near an intersection, which causes spillover congestion. So Tampa is now, as this guidance suggests, mapping out zones mid-block. And to the extent that they can, working with the TNC partners to geofence them. But just the creation of these zones changes things entirely. And you've probably seen lots of signs and examples from around the country during the pandemic of DoorDash and temporary pickup and drop-off zones in all sorts of communities. Planning on where to put them is as simple as a land use database or something more. So this is the second example I love to talk about because it's sort of the same idea, but on steroids. We did some work with the City Tech Collaborative, which is a coalition that was formed by Mayor Rahm Emanuel in Chicago. And they really tried to be incubating new approaches and new think to managing transportation and other aspects. But for this particular project that we were involved in, they're able to attract some of the leading folks in big data. Here, who used to be Navtech, has all sorts of movement data about every form of transportation. Teralytics is similar to Replica and INRIX in that they're tracking cell phone activity. Carrier Direct talks to the freight providers to know exactly what it is that they want and where they're moving logistically. Spot Hero, of course, knows parking demand. You may have already used their app. And Bosch is a technology partner, ready and willing to record mobility data on the streets of Chicago. As it turns out, because of the pandemic, they ended up not doing that last part. But the modeling part that I want to share with you is fascinating. So we began by looking across all modes of transportation in terms of access to the curb and came up with some basic inputs to a modeling process that had to do with the fact that different modes need different amounts of length. A bike can just park in 2 feet of curb if it's head in versus a car that needs 20 or a bus that needs 5 times that. But then the turnover, the rate at which somebody might access it and bring in, like I said, 30 times more rideshare taxis is very different by mode. And that's an important factor here. And when you start to establish these basics, you can start to think that there's greater efficiencies in different modes of access. And as a sidebar, we also did this for streeteries or curbside dining, which are a little bit harder to model because it depends on what the regulatory approach is. And because there's such a small quantity of the total curbs, in this case in Chicago, we didn't include it for this demonstration. So each and every one of those modes has their own things that influence demand. So for instance, we know that, as has already been discussed, there's different levels of occupancy. We want to be able to charge more when it gets above 85 or 90% and charge less when it's below. But it's not just the fact that the price may be up or down. Just the availability of parking is something that influences certain users' access to the curb. It doesn't matter what the price of the curb is. For certain users, if they can never get there, such as a TNC or freight delivery or a bicyclist, just that physical obstacle is enough to influence their demand. So we wanted to be able to understand what is their response to all of these factors, and also what is each mode's individual elasticity or response to changes in pricing for that curb. And truth be told, all these large organizations were contributing their data and participating because they all wanted to see ways to create more revenue at the curb. If we're going to have this many vehicles and turnover, there's got to be some money to come out of it. I'll get to the punchline in a minute on that more business-like interpretation, because the businesses actually are doing a lot that's very valuable. And in this case here was contributing a ton of very specific data mapped out across the entirety of the city on points of interest and activity. This is just a quick map that shows accumulated for just one type of activity, what is going on, whether it's a retailer bringing in customers, whether it's a restaurant that happens to have more activity versus one that has less activity. A lot of the location-based service data, but as well as simple point of interest data, which can come from organizations like this, which you can see on a Google map by just seeing the density of restaurants in your downtown, is a good proxy for the level of activity that you're going to see for rideshare and other modes of access, as well as loading. And then, of course, because they had this large data set and we're able to pull together the Teralytics data, the other movement data, Spot Hero, everybody, we're able to create a map of activity, but then we were able to test various modeling approaches to changes in pricing, rules, and access. Here's the punchline. It wasn't so much that maximizing revenue was the best way to make things work in Chicago. It was actually that maximizing multimodal access to the curb was the highest amount of revenue possible. So essentially, we optimized the curb to increase the amount of trips possible in every one of these subsectors. So the result of the model had 300 dedicated rideshare spaces across the entirety of Chicago, nearly as many taxi spaces, over 500 bike share docks. And the key here, and this is instrumental for many large cities, is that loading zones are often the most inefficient use of space because they're just a loading zone, when in fact loading may only happen during certain periods of time, and loading is often made larger because we don't know how to predict trucks. And what was great about having Carrier Direct on board was to say to freight providers, would you pay to have access to the curb? And they said, heck yeah, if I'm going to get a space, I'll book my deliveries. Now, that's not true in every community, but in a larger community, this is a resource. And so we were able to increase the multimodal access for the downtown. The most significant amount of linear curb space that was reduced was in terms of trucks. And ironically, we actually were able to increase parking for cars in addition to all these other forms of access. But most importantly, we applied pricing rules. Every mode was charged a price to get access and was optimized through a modeling algorithm that pretty much said, this is the most that people are ready and willing to pay by this mode, and then this is the most for this mode. And all those prices varied. And frankly, bikes, it was free. Taxis and TNCs had a small little surcharge on their access. Freight, I think it was $5 to be able to get a reserved space. And cars, well, that was very Shoupian or responsive to demand. And so for many cars, parking areas, it was well over the $7 an hour that Chicago has been maxed out at due to politics. And of course, they should be charging 2 and 3 times that. And this model allowed us to flex that throughout the course of the city. But most importantly, as you can see here, in terms of the amount of spaces that we're able to provide, we actually only lost, or sorry, the amount of trips that were able to come in through the model. We actually only lost a tiny bit of freight delivery. They lost a huge amount of supply, but because they're willing to pay for access, freight delivery still continued to come in to downtown without needing other forms of access. Taxis were the same, bikes had greater access, rideshare had greater access, and automobile parking did, in response to pricing, go down. What did all this mean? That pricing absolutely drove the bus, so to speak. And by simply making access equitable across all modes and charging only a reasonable transaction price, a quarter on a TNC drop-off, we were able to create a lot more space, but most importantly, a lot more revenue that could be shared with the city and with its downtown business improvement districts or other entities to try to make the kind of space and the type of environment that you want. As a sidebar, you can sort of see in this graphic, the bar charts, the modeled revenues, which is basically mostly based on parking pricing, being very high in the furthest to the north of the Chicago Loop, and then being very, very, very low the further you get away. Whereas today in the blue, those revenues, they're not as steeply tiered because, again, Chicago, as much as they're charging $7 an hour, is not charging enough in the areas of highest demand, and in the areas of lowest demand further away, it's charging too much. So it's an important lesson for any of us as we go forward. And I want to wrap on the idea of how we go forward. These are some images from Sidewalk Labs, work that they had done in Toronto a couple years ago, where they planned a city envisioned around flexing space, envisioned around not car parking all the time, but multimodal access. And of course, you know, somebody backed by Google has all sorts of technology tools and all this kind of stuff to make it happen. But to achieve multimodal access, again, back to those essence, we just need to understand what are the land uses who have the demand and how can we maybe get a little bit better at measuring not just the cars, but activity. It can be just using land use data, but it can be, for instance, these are Numina sensors that count cars, bikes, buses, pedestrians, whatever you want. You program them, you slap them on a pole. There's other forms of technologies that are being used around the country to help manage things like loading zones, so that smart loading zones can be booked and managed with an app, but that also then gives us the data to know how often they're being used. These are pay loading spaces in Nashville. People have used little pucks to drop in the streets. There's been pole-mounted cameras that can now detect an entire block of cars to judge what the availability and the level of activity is. And these are all coming down in price to create that constant monitoring. In fact, this is a Sentry meter that is designed to do all the monitoring I just talked about, plus be your friendly parking meter and provide a PDA with other information to you. Cities across North America are integrating these types of observation technologies into what they call smart poles, into bus stop signs, as you see there in New York City in the middle, into even light poles that are recording all of this information, providing Wi-Fi hotspots for people, but also managing the curb. And I close on this last image, which is probably one of the cooler curb management projects in America. It's still more about cars. We're getting there with communities who have put in bike docks, particularly in Portland and Seattle, where they've been really managing their curb lanes and creating on-street bike parking, e-scooter parking, etc. But for those of you who are driving, this is Vegas's TNC pickup drop-off zone right off the strip. So much demand at the nearby hotels. They created this. It's got these signs that tell which TNC driver where to go and then counts down to get them out of there because there's so much turnover. And it is basically live technological management of a curb, but all of it is born on basic data. And that's where I close, is that if you collect good data, even as simple data as your assessing database, you can begin to peel back the onion on who needs to use the curb. And as we've already heard from Blake and Betsy, the number of people who use the curb beyond the person parking their car for an hour or more is significant. The most significant part of our downtowns are those who walk and visit by other means. And that's something we all need to acknowledge. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Jason. That was great. All right, so we have about 20 minutes for questions, and there've been a number of that have come in already on the chat. So thank you everyone for putting in those questions. And I'll start with a few. There's a couple that came in during Blake's presentation about, I thought this was sort of an interesting question. It was about planners. I think, Blake, you said planners being new to curb management. And I wonder, or the question was about, do you mean planners are new to the field, like they're entry level, or it's sort of an issue that planners have not necessarily looked at very much in the past, and so they're sort of new, it's sort of new to them?
I meant that curb management, if you could describe it as a field of study, is new to planners to manage curbs as a thing, as opposed to it being sort of siloed into a bunch of other different disciplines. So curb management was typically like a part of parking plans, how much should parking prices be? But that doesn't capture the full picture as to what that curb space could be utilized for other than just parking. And so if you took that parking like plan and you expanded it to include what else could be in that space, then it would become curb management at that point.
Yeah, thank you. And for any of these questions, if anybody else wants to jump in, feel free. But I'll keep rolling through them. And then there was a question about, I think this sort of goes to a question from John about whether studies capture the incidence of double parking. And again, that was during Blake's presentation. I don't know if you can talk to that or anybody else to speak to that briefly.
So I will mention that, okay, we have a study we're doing right now, sort of a follow-up to the guidebook, where we want to collect, we're trying to collect data at curbs. And this is something that is very challenging to collect because double parking sort of happens at a very specific moment in time in a very specific place. So you would either need to have a person to watch that space the whole time, or you would have to have some kind of way to, remotely monitor that space. And so I would say most municipalities don't have an easy way of doing that right now, outside of maybe some pilots or maybe some bigger cities that have like advanced monitoring technologies. So we're trying to experiment with collecting data like that right now.
I'll offer that one of the easy ways of doing it, if you can get access to an upper story window on a block that's having problems, is just to put a iPad or an iPhone with a time-lapse program in it and record. And you can see, as we've done in many parking studies, when there are incidences of double parking. Because indeed, like Blake says, it's not part of the standard parking protocol where you're going by once every hour or two to note that there's double parking. And it can be a huge problem, particularly with TNCs now. Those cameras, as I showed at the end of my slides, but just a simple time-lapse camera sometimes can be a very effective way. And time-lapse cameras are great because then you can show people the video afterwards and say, stop double parking.
Okay, yeah, great, thank you. I did want to mention, I think we forgot to mention earlier, or I think hopefully it's been dropped in the chat, but I think this presentation is being recorded, can put on to the MPO's page under today's date. They have an MPO calendar on the bostonmpo.org or ctps.org, and they'll have the slides on there too. So keeping things moving along here. So there was a lot of sort of chatter back and forth on a question from Scott, where he had asked about, with COVID impacts lessening, there's some discussion in his community about letting street side dining permits granted during the pandemic expire at the end of 2022. These dining programs have been popular in the neighborhood, but it seems the local municipality is likely to push to end this due to parking constraints. And any ideas for that or thoughts of that? And I know there was some thoughts from Nicholas in the chat and a little bit of back and forth. So anything any of you want to add to that?
I would point out that there's no question that the benefit of a streetery or other active curbside use far outweighs parking one or two cars. It's not even a question. It is, unfortunately, however, an effort to try to make the data behind that. And just reporting, like I showed slides from New York City, doesn't necessarily help somebody in Marshfield or Duxbury or anywhere else in the Commonwealth. And being able to hear from businesses how they responded during the pandemic, as I'm sure Betsy, maybe some interviewees talked about how having on-street dining or others during the pandemic was valuable to those businesses, being able to report things like retail sales. The DHCD's Rapid Recovery Program was able to talk through what had happened with retail sales at the beginning of the pandemic, and to be able to identify that places that did have more access for business in terms of seats on the sidewalk did better than those who did not. It would be a tragedy to see what is a good urban environment created by streeteries go away just for parking one car that nobody is in. I mean, a streetery can seat 12 diners versus nobody except a metallic car. So I hope that folks at least appreciate that trade-off. And we've definitely seen communities, as Betsy mentioned, who've really embraced that, but some, you're right, are fearful.
Yeah, I want to second what Jason said about like gathering information about how, especially if you've done like a quick build project of some sort, to be able to say like, this was what our data before, you know, in terms of usage of the street or of the business nearby or of the parking space. And this is what happened when we changed it into a parklet or changed it into a dining space. And we didn't look into in the study like specific ways of doing that analysis kind of before and after. I didn't hear a lot from our interviewees that they had that they specifically had a method for, or they were going to pursue for sure kind of a pre and post analysis. I think part of it was they didn't necessarily have the pre-COVID information, right? And if they wanted to do a post, or at that point in COVID analysis. But I think that some towns have, I think Arlington has, I think some other towns have put some effort into like trying to see what the impact of their kind of COVID curb space usage changes have been. And I think that's absolutely huge, and doesn't necessarily have to be as detailed as Jason described. It could be a little bit more qualitative or kind of low tech, whether it's counting cars, counting passenger or use, you know, people who are using a particular parklet or dining area, or just talking to the business owners. And but I think, yeah, definitely establishing that before and after information about how people have been using your investment your infrastructure is going to be really important for helping to make that argument that we should be keeping these COVID changes to our streets.
Thank you. Just to follow up briefly on the Arlington example, we did, this was something done by our economic development coordinator, so I'm a little bit less familiar with it, but they did a survey about the parklets and, you know, the on-street dining that was done, I think, through, we had the sort of like economic or sort of pandemic economic recovery committee that was meeting, you know, over the last couple of years, and they did a survey about like how are people liking the parklets, and I'd say that overwhelmingly it was very positive, that people were very excited about the parklets. They wanted to happen. It was something we'd kind of talked about prior to the pandemic, so it was sort of one of those things that we'd done during the pandemic that we might have not done otherwise. And so that was something that was shared with our select board, and they were very appreciative. And, you know, that was a way to prove that there was quite a lot of interest in it, and something that we should continue doing. And I'll mention also that just this thought came to mind, is that the quality of that outdoor dining space is important too. You know, we're finding that if we don't have umbrellas on any of our tables, people won't sit there for sort of obvious reasons if there's no shade. So, you know, I think that certainly make sure that's a good quality space. And I do want to just, there was a question about the parking benefits district, about how to put one together, how long to put one together. And I know Blake had answered with the, where that is in the Commonwealth Massachusetts laws. The parking benefits district in Arlington was created before my time, so I don't know the exact answer to the question, but because we're a town, we created a committee in order to oversee that and oversee the implementation of parking meters in Arlington Center. But because of the way that we are structured in terms of budgeting, we do have to have PBD expenditures approved by our town meeting. So there's sort of, it's been put into the process that we have, which, you know, can be a bit of a lengthy process, but the actual creation of it is probably something to discuss with, you know, your town manager, city management, and others who would know more about utilizing that process. So
I was going to throw in fast, Daniel, for what it's worth. The state legislation that encourages PBDs lets you go as fast as you want, absent your local process. It does require a clear designation of funding, where it goes into which pots within 5 years, but you could move as fast as you want once you designated a boundary.
Thank you. Yeah, and we've used that funding for not only doing, you know, using it to make public space improvements, but it's also good for simply reinvesting back into the program for parking enforcement and for maintenance of the meters and other things. And so it's a very good reinvestment tool. There was a question about, I'm trying to find it again. Oh, so I guess this might be similar to the question about double parking, but there's a question from Alejandro about, is there any modeling or metric that includes vehicle occupancy, you know, about the number of passengers being picked up or dropped off when it comes to maybe ride hailing or ride sharing, that is included, I guess, in the modeling?
Yeah, I'll just say briefly, I mean, I think we only used the census reported average vehicle occupancies and then made a sort of an educated guess on what that meant for rideshare pickup drop off. There is not necessarily a clear source, and that's largely because Uber and Lyft are not sharing how many occupants, and especially these days, it's been more or less just the one rider with the driver. But in general, I think the focus is not so much on how many people are in the car, but how many turns a TNC, a transportation network company, a rideshare operator can get versus a car that's just sitting there. And it's the same point that goes back to Scott's question about parking versus a streetery, and this is true for any place, anywhere I've ever worked. Don't forget, the front door spaces in front of a business are never enough for that business, ever. Like a business may be lucky to have 1, 2, or 3 spaces out front, and they think that's their spaces. Their customers are coming from everywhere. Spaces over there, a bus down there. They biked in and they walked. They parked at another business and they crossed the street. You could just ask a business person to look at the average vehicle occupancy, the number of people coming in and out of a car nearby, and realize that they would much prefer something active versus a parking space. So I think that's an important part of any of these data collection methods, and just an important principle in general for curb access and reform.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was good. And I know Blake has been answering some of these questions in the chat, but I think just briefly, if you can reiterate about Phil's question on the 90% versus 85% question on parking supply. I know that you kind of answered that, but hopefully if you talk about that for a moment on how that number is, or that percentage is created.
Yeah, so I think the 90% was turning, I think what Donald Shoup originally said in I think High Cost of Free Parking,
Yep.
the Bible of parking, that I think it's like 1 or 2 spaces open per block is sort of like the rule of thumb. I think it's a rule of thumb, and it's not really a science necessarily, where like there was some modeling that came out with like 85 is better than 90. I think maybe like the percent numbers might communicate sort of like a more precision than is probably warranted for the rule of thumb. So, about 85 or 90 is probably fine. And that 5% in most cases is probably a rounding, would probably be rounded off in some cases if there's not that many parking spaces on the block. So I think either one's okay.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. We've got just a couple of more. So this is kind of an interesting question from Alejandro about optimizing curb management based on different metrics like revenue, traffic, safety, et cetera, and sort of the weight that you give to each of those metrics, and the priority that you give to each of those metrics. So I don't know if Jason, you can sort of speak to that, and I don't know, maybe that's partly based on what the community or the client is maybe looking at, but maybe you can answer that.
Yeah, I mean, and the example that I walk through in Chicago is like advanced modeling using an infinite amount of data that most of us are not going to have access to. Sure, we begin to have more access to location-based data more and more, but I think in general, that's not something most people should expect to have. But the principles that were applied would generally apply anywhere, which is we were trying to find the optimal balance between the known quantity of people coming in, which is using land use databases essentially, and actual counts wherever you can have it, versus their price sensitivity and other factors that may drive them away, such as, it's uncomfortable to park there, or just the demand alone is discouraging me because I'm a bicyclist, so I'm going to go somewhere else. So we tried to measure how people would respond if things were better. Oftentimes folks will say, for instance, about a bike lane, build it and they will come. And then a lot of folks say, well, why didn't they come? Well, because the bike lane went 1 block. You have to build a system to be able to make it work, for instance. Same with bus lanes or other forms of access. But once you start something that's recognizing the balance should be tilted towards other forms of access because the latent demand is huge, then that's really what is the essential measure. you've got a lot of cars, a lot of people who want to get access to a business near downtown. Yeah, maybe even all of them are driving fine, but they ain't all parking out front. And a lot of them are price sensitive. A lot of them are willing to walk. Many of them don't want to be in a congested environment. When you start to understand all of that, your parking system is 10 times the size of your main street. And therefore 10 times as many of your patrons are parking somewhere else today with a poorly managed curb. The more we acknowledge that we can get others in there, the better we'll do.
Great. All right, I think we're gonna finish off with this last question, which was actually one of our sort of seed questions, which has a great interest to me, and I'd be interested to hear what the panel, what everybody has to say about this. But how can curb management further their Vision Zero goals? So Vision Zero regarding, towards zero deaths, reducing deaths and fatalities on our roadways through, sort of systems thinking. How does this sort of pair up with Vision Zero that's going on in around the world, and also with the new sort of shared streets for all programming that's coming through the bipartisan infrastructure law? So anybody wants to take that on?
Well, I can start. So I think that like once a community establishes like Vision Zero as a goal, then its curb plans and its priorities should be aligned to accomplish that goal. And you don't accomplish Vision Zero with faster cars and more parking. And so that gets integrated into the curb management plan, where you prioritize safety essentially as the number one thing. And so in that case, like your models or whatever metrics you're using, like you're looking for where is there safety hotspots where things are not, where you're seeing fatalities of pedestrians, cyclists, or motor accidents, things like that. And then your curb management plan should accommodate that. It should address that by saying that in cases where you have fatalities occurring, then things like protected bike infrastructure is a higher priority by default in that area, as for example. And also I think that it can go a little farther than that, and maybe you could say that like prioritizing like bus lanes would incentivize transit travel, which is going to be safer per mile of travel. And so that's a way to also like reduce vehicle travel and car dependency and potentially vehicle accidents as well. So kind of thinking big picture about how to basically reduce the speeds and the quantity of heavy objects on the road.
Yeah, I can't agree more with what Blake is saying, both at the local level, like in the Tampa example, and then at the high level, like Blake is concluding on. Like that's really what our goal in communities has to be. Even if you don't have a Vision Zero action plan, you should be aiming towards safety. But once you create those better forms of access, we're getting rid of some of the things that are really problematic. That's distracted driving. You're looking for a parking space, you're hunting for something, you're not paying attention to the crosswalk. If there's a space and it's clear, that's valuable. The double parking that we talked about, blocking crosswalks or blocking bike lanes, the rideshare vehicles doing that. Those are really, really bad. If it hasn't been stated before, we all know pedestrian fatalities went up during the pandemic when driving went down. That's a disaster because we were all distracted. And I guarantee you there were a lot of curb lane problems. Let's manage them better.
So,
I guess I would
go ahead, sorry.
no, that's okay. I would just end on saying that curb management doesn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, we talk about it as a field in itself, but I think as Blake kind of indicated in his presentation, that it is also part of a lot of other things, including safety. And a lot of the curb management things that we've talked about do contribute themselves to safety. And so we want to be paying attention to where are our crashes happening and what kind of crashes are they, right? Are they like parking crashes, side swipes, someone just, the lane out of the parking lane, the bicyclist getting doored, is, what kind of crashes are we talking about? and what can our kind of a menu of curb options do to, prevent these, particularly the most serious crashes. We know that putting the more kind of things you have on a street that tell the driver that you're entering a busy place with lots of people, slow down, please, like that is going to help slow down traffic naturally without having to put in, lots of stoplights or bumps or whatever, having pedestrian infrastructure with barriers near the curb, making sure that all the design elements that you're putting on your street are telling the drivers you need to slow down, because at the end of the day, like, speed is the killer, right? It's and the more that we can do to kind of address that and slow people down where it's necessary in our downtowns, and curb management can be a really important is a really important tool in making that happen.
I have one final point about that.
Okay.
I think that there's some benefit in the first foundation of curb management that I discussed in my presentation, which is to establish sort of committees and commissions that sort of monitor and discuss how to solve problems, and creating a Vision Zero committee is a great first step to start that process, so that there is some group of people that is paying attention to what is happening locally. Because we hear these stats about growing pedestrian fatalities on a nationwide level, but how do you address that in your neighborhood, in your community? Just like with everything that happens in the city, everything's local and it's related to specific problems in specific areas. Maybe the cars on this specific road go slightly too fast on this turn or something like that. And there needs to be people that are paying attention to those things and can make those recommendations. And sort of the very scaled down version is kind of like the NTSB of when there's an accident, when someone gets hit by a car, kind of like when there's a plane or a train accident. There's people that pays attention to what happened, what caused that, and how could we prevent that in the future.
Thank you, Blake. Yep, we'll need to end on that. Very much appreciate everybody's answers. And so thank you again. Thank you to our three panelists for the presentation, sharing their expertise, Betsy, Harvey, Blake, Acton, and Jason Schreiber. As a reminder for everyone here who's still on with us, this webinar has been approved, 1.5 AICP certification maintenance credits. The MPO staff will be sending out a follow-up communication to everyone who registered for today's webinar. So again, that would have the recording and the slides as well. So thank you all for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.